Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
A lot of times we'll hear a reference to a book called Child Bride. Child Bride was written by an author named Suzanne Finstad. Interestingly, I spent a decent amount of time talking about another one of Suzanne Finstad's book in a previous video. This was a book about Natalie Wood called Natasha. In that video, I very much praised the book Natasha. I feel like this was seminal work in understanding and interpreting Natalie Wood's story. I feel like it was very influential in calling to light certain discrepancies and inconsistencies around the police investigation of her death. And it played a very large role in getting the case reopened. That is not to say that it is not without controversy. There have been some statements made through the years by people who say that they were misquoted. And, just to do my due diligence, I feel it's necessary to point that out.
Then the judge issues a ruling. And let me just read to you here what the judge said in his ruling, just part of it. The court does not find Finstad's testimony credible.
Wow.
This is what a Superior Court judge said about Suzanne Finstad, the author.
Just kind of an odd coincidence that she's coming up in very close proximity in two videos. What we look at when people talk about Child Bride is the discrepancy between the version of events Priscilla told us in Elvis and Me and the version of events Suzanne Finstad gives us in Child Bride. What people really focus on here is everything leading up to Priscilla coming to Memphis to live with Elvis, specifically her life before she met him, the circumstances around how she met him, and her life for the brief period of time after he returned to the United States and she remained in Germany. And then again, looking at the circumstances of their divorce, what led to that, very specific things about the divorce, and her life post-Elvis. There is a section, unlike Elvis and Me, which ends with Elvis's death. Priscilla really doesn't tell us in her own words anything about the events of her taking over the estate, her experiences running the estate, her decision to open Graceland to the public. None of that is addressed in Elvis and Me. It is addressed in some detail in Child Bride, so we get a whole extra chapter which describes her life from the time she divorced Elvis until the time the book was written, which was in 1997. So this book has some age on it. It's brought up a lot, and it still is, I think, by some people considered to be very relevant. Sometimes I forget that it actually is an older book. So looking at the two stories in this book, people who are proponents of the idea that Child Bride tells the authentic story and Elvis and Me does not. So what they are mostly talking about there has to do with the opinion that Priscilla created a fairy tale when she wrote Elvis and Me, that she really glossed over things, didn't give an authentic version of events. This is definitely an idea that Suzanne Finstad holds. In the preface to the book, where she's explaining a little bit about how this book came to be, she shares that she was kind of interested in the subject of Priscilla because she realized that for somebody who was covered so often in Elvis biography, that for all the information she came across about Priscilla in these accounts, she didn't really walk away from any of this with a very clear idea of who Priscilla was as a person. And she thought this was curious. And this even continued when she read Elvis and Me. She felt like by reading this, that this might give her some window into Priscilla, help her get to know her as a three-dimensional person more. But after reading the book, she walked away from this not feeling like she had a clearer understanding of her at all. She decided Priscilla would be an interesting topic for a book. It's worth noting Priscilla cooperated with this book. She gave her several hours of interviews. There are a lot of direct quotes from Priscilla that she directly said to Suzanne Finstad in the book. So we get a decent amount of Priscilla in her own words. What Miss Finstad says is that when she was writing this book, she began to become aware of some very wide discrepancies between the way that Priscilla described events, both in Elvis and Me and in her interviews with Suzanne, and what she was learning from other people that she interviewed, people who knew Priscilla through the years. And so she constructed this theory that Priscilla had sort of created this glossed over, sugar-coated image of herself, of her time with Elvis. And she felt that there was a disconnect there between what other people were telling her and what Priscilla was telling her. And a surprising amount of this really has to do with Priscilla's younger years. Not that she doesn't talk about things when she's older, she certainly does. But there's a lot of focus on the accounts of peers of Priscilla's, classmates, friends, people who knew her when she was growing up, and how that differs a little bit from the way Priscilla describes things. So let's talk a little bit about what some of these differences are and what they ultimately may add up to, and what difference does it make? That's the question that intrigues me. So starting with Priscilla's version of events, she describes herself relocating to Germany with her family. Her stepfather, Captain Beaulieu, was in the military, and so the family had relocated to Germany. She describes this as being something that was a fairly lonely and isolating experience for her as a young girl. She reports feeling really out of place, not making many friends, feeling lonely. This was also somewhat influenced by the fact that, as many people know, she had learned prior to this that the man that she believed was her biological father was actually her mother's second husband. Her biological father had died when she was very young. Her mother had remarried. She learned this information. It was impressed upon her by both of her parents that this was something that she couldn't share with other people. They felt that this was something that would upset her younger siblings. They treated it a little bit, it sounds like this was sort of a taboo subject and something that she wasn't allowed to talk about. So when Priscilla's describing this, she really describes it as the source of some of her loneliness and confusion at this time in her adolescence. She also found this out really right at the beginning of adolescence, and so this already being a thorny and complex time for a lot of people did not help circumstances for her. When we look at the child bride version of this and how Suzanne Finstad interprets this, she really sees this as the key thing that led to what she considers to be Priscilla's lifelong habit of secrecy, being more concerned about her image, being guarded. She feels that her family impressing this on her, treating this like taboo, and encouraging her to keep secrets was something that had a profound effect on her. So Priscilla tells us that she first came to meet Elvis because, well, she was at the Eagle Club, which was sort of a recreational club for officers' families. She was approached by a man named Curry Grant. Curry Grant was around 27 years old at the time. And she says, out of nowhere, this gentleman approached her, asked her if she would like to meet Elvis. She was pretty surprised. At first, really thought this was a joke. It was hard for her to believe. She knew, of course, that Elvis was stationed in Germany. You know, according to her, it had never crossed her mind that they would possibly meet. And so this really was like winning the lottery to her. So she really describes this as having been a complete shock. And this is really where I think when people talk about the sort of fairy tale spin of her accounts, this is kind of an example of what they're talking about, one of the pivotal things. A stranger approached her, offered her this 1 in a million opportunity. She was this 14-year-old girl and, you know, out of nowhere was kind of given the chance of a lifetime. The Suzanne Finstad version of things says that it was Priscilla who approached Curry Grant. Curry was a friend of Elvis's. He was part of Elvis's social circle at the time. He had apparently kind of been given the duty of scouting the club and girls, or to invite girls to the parties that Elvis would hold. I guess word had kind of gotten out on the base that he was the guy to go to if you wanted to meet Elvis, presumably based off of Suzanne Finstad's version of things. Priscilla knew this information, decided to approach him, had her sights on meeting Elvis.
Tell me about it, stud.
And very stridently approached him and announced that she understood that he could introduce her to Elvis and she wanted to meet him. This might seem like it's not a very big difference. You know, when I first read this, I really thought, who cares? And it is important because when you're first reading this and you don't really know where it's going, it does seem a little bit odd that the author is spending so much time on the discrepancy of what these two people say. Priscilla saying it was Curry who approached her, Curry saying it was Priscilla who approached him. I didn't really think it was that big of a deal. But as the book goes on, we learn in excruciating detail why this is being focused on so much and why the author thinks this matters so much. After a pretty innocuous start with these two versions, things take a pretty uncomfortable tone from this point forward. According to Curry, as part of this conversation that Priscilla had with him, it was made explicitly clear in their interactions that in order for him to introduce her to Elvis, he was going to expect something in return. And by expect something in return, and any of the worst case scenarios that might come to mind when you hear the phrase expect something in return, that's what we're talking about. Curry Grant at this time, as I said, he was in his late 20s. He was married. He had 2 children. He was brutally honest in his interviews with Suzanne Finstad about the fact that from the first time he laid eyes on Priscilla, he was very attracted to her physically. He is very clear about the fact that his intention was to sleep with her. He talks about how when she came into the club and he would see her, was really preoccupied with her. He felt like he had to play his cards carefully with her. He wanted to approach her. He was attracted to her. He was interested in her. However, he was waiting for kind of the right opening to be able to make a move. And so when Priscilla approached him and expressed her interest in meeting Elvis, this was kind of his golden opportunity. He really talks about dangling this prospect to her, manipulating her, trying to get her where he wanted her so that he could get what he wanted from her. I'm going to be really honest at this point in the book. I was very uncomfortable with what he was saying, and not necessarily because of how it reflected on Priscilla, but how it reflected on him. It confused me why somebody would really even want to share that they had done this in the first place. There was also a point where the writing and the tone towards Priscilla around this point really took a drastic turn. This became not so much the focus on the inappropriateness, on a 27-year-old man plotting to take sexual advantage of a 14-year-old girl, but taking a very shaming tone toward Priscilla. I felt like the book really came across as trying to present her as promiscuous, as wanton, and that started to bother me. I did not enjoy reading anything Curry Grant had to say. He was extremely explicit about his attraction to Priscilla. He was extremely explicit about doing manipulative things in order to turn the situation the way that he wanted it to. I don't know which one of them is telling the truth about it, and I really don't care. And what I mean by that is that this book asks us from this point in the story to take a negative tone toward Priscilla, to see her as somebody who was promiscuous at a young age and was willing to sleep with Curry Grant in order to meet Elvis. My thought about this is that she was 14. Even if this is true, even if she completely instigated this situation, as a minor, I feel that this was still a situation that was exploitive towards her. In fact, it's a criminal act. It would be statutory rape. Regardless of how complicit Priscilla might have been in this, the law assumes here that somebody this age is not capable of giving consent. And it started to strike me as really distasteful that the author was belaboring this point so much. She puts an extreme amount of emphasis on this. She returns to it a million times throughout the course of the story. According to this, Curry did sleep with Priscilla. After this, he introduced her to Elvis. Immediately, Elvis and Priscilla bonded, started spending time alone together. Their relationship started to take off. And at some point, Elvis indicated to Priscilla, this is all Suzanne Finstad telling us this, Elvis had indicated to Priscilla that it was his desire to marry a virgin. So what Suzanne Finstad speculates happens, Priscilla suddenly realized that if Elvis were to know what had happened between her and Curry Grant, this would ruin her chances of marrying him. So she constructs this theory that Priscilla therefore went to great lengths to distance herself from Curry Grant, to make up stories about what had happened between them, basically to do whatever she could to suppress this information from reaching Elvis, because if it were to reach him, according to this theory, that would spoil her chances of being able to marry him. She then, sort of ties this to, in later years, after Elvis's death, Priscilla denying that this had happened with Curry Grant and giving a different version of events. This is where the logic really starts to break down for me, because what Suzanne Finstad really tries to prove, and I think she actually makes a decent case of, is that Elvis never knew what had happened between Priscilla and Curry. Suzanne Finstad actually calls it in the book the virgin bride myth. So she basically says that Priscilla's insistence that she and Elvis were not sexually active until they were married is all part of this lie that she constructed to sort of hide this thing that had happened with Curry when she was very young, and that's what she promoted when she wrote Elvis and Me. The logic here doesn't make sense to me. By this point, Elvis had already passed, so there was no reason to try to suppress this from him. She had to pretend to be a virgin to get Elvis to marry her. You see where I'm going with this? It doesn't make sense. There's also a very annoying thing about the way she writes about this, which is that she has to remind us of this claim of Curry Grant's that he had slept with Priscilla almost every paragraph of the book in a very clunky way. So we're going years in the story. Priscilla's an adult. Curry hasn't been in the story in forever. And every move that Priscilla makes in a very clunky way, Suzanne Finstad will remind us. And she did this because when she was 14, she slept with Curry Grant and then had to hide it from Elvis because he wanted to marry a virgin. So she created the virgin bride myth. And that's what she's been desperately trying to suppress for the public for years. And it gets to the point where she's even like, it could be like Priscilla boiled an egg, but somehow it was because of all this. She ties it back to this over and over and over again in a way that just made zero sense to me. I felt like she was really beating us over the head with this. I felt like it was very judgy of Priscilla. And I honestly just don't feel like it matters. I really don't. I feel like either way, Priscilla was being exploited in this situation with Curry, and I don't think it's particularly relevant. The idea of judging a minor for a situation in which they were being sexually exploited is very distasteful to me. It's very uncomfortable reading. He describes in very explicit detail the intensity of the physical attraction he had toward Priscilla, how strong his desire to sleep with her was, how willing he was to do anything to make this happen. It's not comfortable to read about. In fact, I would almost go as far to argue that when we're talking about a minor and such a distasteful situation, somebody who was clearly being exploited by an older person, I'm not sure that this was something that even needed to be included in the book. I just feel that there are some things that are private. There are some things that just are not a good optic for the author. One thing, when I'm reading a biography, what I want is for the author to kind of seamlessly blend into the narrative. When I become too aware of a bias that an author has, or a place where they're being very subjective, or where their own opinion or slant on things is interfering with their objectivity, it starts to make me distance myself from the book a little bit. I don't really want the hand of the author in a biography, if that makes sense, because they start to lose credibility. And this really continues throughout Priscilla's teenage years. In Priscilla's version of events, after Elvis left, she was very lonely. She just sat around and pined for him. She was isolated from her peers. She didn't date. She didn't have any other boyfriends, that sort of thing. And so what Suzanne Finstad presents in contrast are quotes from Priscilla's classmates and friends at the time who say that she had several boyfriends during this time, that she was sexually active with some of them. And it's so weird because, there's one guy that Suzanne Finstad couldn't really confirm if they were intimate or not. And throughout the book, when she is reminding us over and over and over again of the fact that Priscilla has been disingenuous about whether or not she was a virgin when she married Elvis, she has to go and list each of these guys too. Curry Grant, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy when she was a senior in high school. And maybe this guy, but we don't know for sure because I couldn't confirm it. That just started to seem really ridiculous to me. I'm just going to be honest. I don't think it's any of our business if Priscilla was a virgin when she got married or not. I felt like even for 1997, which granted was, some time ago, this felt like a really regressive attitude. I'm just not comfortable with the idea of shaming somebody because they weren't a virgin when they got married, regardless of whether or not they have sold this story of their innocence and virtue and purity to the public for years and years and years. To me, it was kind of a big nothing burger. With the Curry Grant situation, I felt like that was 100% statutory rape, if what he was saying was true. And so I didn't walk away from that with a negative feeling about Priscilla. I actually had a negative feeling about Curry Grant for sharing this story in the first place. He's either making it up, which is very disturbing to me that somebody would create a story like this if it's not true, or he's sharing something that, why would you want people to know? To me, that just really expresses a desire to be somebody in this story, or to get attention, or to attach himself to the story that is a little bit distasteful. That is weird. Now there's the other piece of it, which is Priscilla's version of the events. She absolutely denies Curry's version of events. What she says happened is that A, Curry was the one to approach her. B, the idea that they had ever struck any kind of a deal or bargain about her sleeping with him in order to meet Elvis, according to her, is absolutely untrue. What's interesting is that in Elvis and Me, she does talk about these events, but she ascribes them to somebody whom she calls Kurt. She does identify that she is using an alias for Kurt to protect his identity. And she does mention Curry Grant by name prior to this, but she doesn't say anything negative about him in the book. She describes him being the person who introduced her to Elvis. Her parents at first were skeptical about why this grown man was inviting her to do this, and they wanted to meet him first before they would give her permission. She says he and his wife came. After talking to he and his wife, her parents felt comfortable with this, and so they granted her permission to go. And then after that, she doesn't mention him again. So her descriptions of him are favorable. When she mentions this person named Kurt, he's described as being somebody else. And she describes this incident where when Kurt was driving her, this happened. He attempted to assault her and she fought him off. Now, she takes it a step further in the book, and she also says that she had shared this with Elvis and that this enraged him. He was furious with Kurt, and as a result, Kurt was banished from the group. and, presumably never heard from again. Now, one thing that Suzanne Finstad does point out, it is true that Curry remained in Elvis's social sphere throughout the time that Elvis was in Germany, and then for a while after. So I'm not really sure exactly. So there's a discrepancy there. Priscilla says Kurt was banished from the group in Germany, and that was the last of him. We do know that Curry was around for a bit longer. What that all adds up to, I'm not really sure. I don't know exactly why she described Kurt as leaving the group, if she was indeed talking about Curry. I think it's possible that might have been an attempt to just kind of throw people off the scent of Curry, come up with a tidy explanation for what happened to Kurt. I really don't know. What Suzanne Finstad says is that this was her attempt to have an explanation in case Curry ever did come forward with the information that they had slept together. I don't really know. That seems like a little bit of a stretch to me, being that she does not refer to Curry by name when she's talking about these events. Another thing that's weird is that Suzanne Finstad interviewed Mike Edwards, one of Priscilla's ex-boyfriends, someone who she had dated after Elvis passed. And he said that she did tell him this story about her and Curry Grant. She told him basically the same thing that she says about Kurt, that there was an incident when Curry was driving her where he attempted to assault her and she fought him off. Now, there's another weird quote from Mike Edwards here where he claims that when she told him this, he didn't really believe it. He felt like there was more to the story, that she wasn't being completely upfront about it, and he doubted her version of events. He felt that she perhaps had really slept with Curry Grant and wasn't telling him the truth about it. I think that's a very weird thing to think about your girlfriend telling you about an attempted assault when she was 14. So I don't know what to make of that comment. It just seems like an odd reaction. It doesn't override the fact to me that if Curry Grant's version of events is true, I don't think that that's something to judge Priscilla over. I would feel this way about any 14-year-old. One thing that kind of bothers me a little bit about the way it's presented is that the author really takes the tone that somehow it's a noble service, or this is information that the public really needs to know. Priscilla's lies need to be exposed, and we all need to know the truth, and this is doing some kind of a public service. I don't think it does. I think if this is true, what happened was sad. Doesn't make me think less of Priscilla. I just think that this was information that didn't bear repeating. And I feel that way really about everything leading up to Priscilla coming of age that's covered within the book. The other stories about her dating as a teenager, having boyfriends, being sexually active, whatever. I just don't feel that that's something to judge anybody over. She was young. I don't think it's shameful that she wasn't a virgin when she got married. If that is indeed true, who knows? I don't think it's any of our business. Another thing I think is worth pointing out is that by being very insistent that she and Elvis were not sexually active until they were married, that portrayal protects Elvis. And, I wonder why people would really want to poke holes in it. That may be something that protects her image, but it also protects Elvis's image.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you so state under penalty of perjury that the testimony you shall give in your deposition shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.